Welcome to Hot Air TV. I'm Michelle Malkin. We've got a special show for you today. We're joined by Robert Spencer, a very good friend of Hot Air TV, the host of the weekly show Jihad Watch here on Hot Air, and the best-selling author of The Truth About Muhammad, founder of the world's most intolerant religion. Thanks so much for joining us, Robert.
Thank you, Michelle.
It's a great opportunity to get more in depth with you and actually do something novel in a book interview, talk about the book. And I want to start with the cover because you've got a special blurb here endorsing you, and it says, quote, "May Allah rip out his spine from his back and split his brains in two and then put them both back and then do it over and over again." That's one special thumbs up. Who wrote that, and what was the context of that?
That appeared at an Islamic bulletin board on the web, revivingislam.com, which I don't believe exists anymore. And they were writing about various things that I had posted from their site, and they didn't like the attention. And so this was one of the things that they posted about me. They also noted that I was already on a hit list. But Allah hasn't ripped the spine from my back yet, and so I'm still at it.
And thank God for that. You get these kinds of attacks almost on a daily basis, running the Jihad Watch website and writing the books that you do. Why write the truth about Muhammad?
Well, you know, actually, it took me a long time to decide to write this book. And it was only after some very careful consideration and some consultation with family and friends that I decided to do so, because I was aware that the consequences could be lethal. I have received 5 new death threats since the book came out, and some of them were very specific. And so it wasn't as if I wasn't aware of the risks. But I don't want to live in a country where we give in to violent intimidation and decline to discuss things that I think are important to bring into the public discourse. And I didn't want to give in to that violent intimidation myself. I think there's some things that have to be confronted nowadays in the debate about the war on terror, and one of the most important ones is the elements of the Islamic religion that are giving rise to violence and extremism. If we do not confront them, then they will simply continue to give rise to violence and extremism. So I think they had to be brought to light, despite the risks.
In your introduction, you mentioned the Muhammad cartoons and how that played into your thinking about writing about this book. And for a lot of people who haven't been awakened yet to the truths that you've told in your past books and in this one, that was a real defining moment, the reaction to the cartoons. And do you think we've made progress since that episode, or has there been a backsliding?
In a funny way, there's a step forward and a step back in all these things, in the cartoon controversy and the controversy over the Pope's remarks, in several other incidents recently. Every time these things happen, they represent a victory for the global jihad as well as a defeat, because they will find that there are many, many officials in the United States and in Western countries, officials and media figures, who are willing, even anxious, to bow down and to kowtow to this violent intimidation, to give them what they want, in a sense, and to restrict themselves voluntarily from doing anything that they might offend them, and in other words, to accept Islamic standards over their behavior. Whereas at the same time, each of these incidents also has been the occasion for many people to wake up and to realize what we're facing, the magnitude of what we're facing. And so each one is both positive and negative, and I think it's just going to continue to play out in that way, with more and more supine officials and media figures, but also with an increasing awareness from the public, such that I hope things will ultimately break and that these things will be able to be discussed in the mainstream.
Speaking of supine, we are spoon-fed, not just from the left and not just from the grievance mongers of CARE and these other Muslim advocacy groups, but also from the right, from the White House, from the very top, spoon-fed this idea that A, Islam is a religion of peace, and B, the Prophet Muhammad, even saying that, you know, it's a staple of every newspaper's coverage of Muhammad to say that he is a model of peace and pacifism in this religion of peace. Why are people so willing to accept that and be so incredibly incurious about the truth about Muhammad.
I think people are anxious to accept it because it's comforting. Because if they assume that there is a benign core at the heart of Islam, then ultimately these things will be all right. Then we can assume that people within the Islamic community will reassert the core values of Islam and stamp out the so-called extremists. And that is something that I think goes very well and very easily coalesces with American pluralist and multiculturalist assumptions about, and relativist assumptions about all religions being basically equal in both in their capacity to inspire good and their capacity to inspire evil. And the case is so often made. I mean, whenever I speak about these things for years now, and I speak about the elements of Islam that are giving rise to violence, the first reaction people have is to start talking about Christianity, which is ultimately irrelevant. Christianity could be the most evil thing on the planet, and it wouldn't tell us anything, one way or the other, about the elements of Islam that are inspiring violence today, and the global jihad movement that is operating according to the principles of Islam. And so, for Karen Armstrong to compare Muhammad to Gandhi, which she does and has done on repeated occasions, is just pure fantasy. And the most outlandish fantasy, really, if anybody looks at the truth about Muhammad. But it's such a comforting fantasy, and it's one that helps us to maintain the assumptions that so many want to maintain, that I think it still has legs. It's still popular among people, as outlandish as it is.
Right, and Karen Armstrong, for our viewers who might not know who she is, one of the most sort of popular and widespread biographers of Muhammad out there, propped up in the mainstream media, of course, because she, her work sort of bolsters all of these myths about Muhammad that comfort people.
Very much so, yes.
Right.
And she has a new book out, came out right about the same time as mine, a new biography of Muhammad. It's actually her second biography of him. Mm-hmm. And I looked at it, we used the same sources, came to very different conclusions. And so, Ms. Armstrong, if you're watching this, I'd be very happy to discuss these things, to debate them in a public forum. You can contact me at jihadwatch, at director@jihadwatch.org.
We'll broadcast it right here at Hot Air, uncut and uncensored. I want to talk about some of the sources that you used and a little bit about some of these terms, because again, I think it's so helpful for people to just have Muhammad 101, and you can't get this on most cable TV shows or broadcast shows where their eyes glaze over when you start talking about chapter and verse, and you really debate these people on their own terms and with their own sources. And you relied on a couple of things, and I want you to explain a couple of terms for people: tafsir, hadith, sunnah, and Sirah. What do these mean?
Tafsir is commentary on the Quran. The Quran is, of course, the holy book of Islam. But the Quran itself is not very clear, especially for somebody who doesn't know anything about Islam and picks up a Quran to read it. There's one speaker in the Quran, that's Allah, and he's speaking to Muhammad. If you can imagine two people you don't know having a conversation about events in which you were not involved and not bothering to fill you in, that's like reading the Quran.
Right.
So you have to go to the tafsir, commentary on the Quran, written by Muslims and studied by Muslims today if they want to understand their faith, to understand the Quran. Hadith also fills in the Quran. Much of Hadith is tafsir. Hadith is traditions of Muhammad, his words and his deeds, and it fills in the circumstances of the revelation.